In the grand halls of Westminster Abbey, where centuries of British history have unfolded, where kings and queens have been crowned and buried, where the most solemn moments of the monarchy have played out before the world's watching eyes, something unprecedented happened on September 8th, 2022. As 2 billion people watched from across the globe, as world leaders sat in silent reverence, as the nation held its collective breath, the most composed member of the royal family witnessed something that would forever change how the world saw the future King of England. Princess, and known for her unwavering strength and stoic demeanor, watched her brother Charles, soon-to-be King Charles III, break down in a way that revealed the human heart beating beneath the crown. This is not just another story about royal protocol or ceremonial grandeur. This is the story of a brother's grief, a sister's love, and a moment so raw and authentic that it reminded the world that even those born to rule are, at their core, simply human beings saying goodbye to their mother. What happened in those sacred moments would ripple through the monarchy, through the hearts of millions watching, and through the very fabric of how we understand duty, love, and loss. This is that story, told through the eyes of those who were there, who witnessed the breaking and the healing, who saw a future king become simply a son, and a sister become a guardian of not just tradition, but of the human spirit itself. The morning of September 8th, 2022, dawned gray and somber over London, as if the very sky understood the gravity of what was to come. Princess Anne stood at the window of her private quarters in Buckingham Palace, watching the early morning light struggle through the heavy clouds. She had barely slept, her mind racing with the endless details that needed to be perfect for this day, the day they would lay their mother, Queen Elizabeth II, to rest. And had always been the practical one, the no-nonsense member of the family who could be counted on when duty called. While Charles wrestled with the philosophical weight of kingship, and William balanced modern expectations with ancient traditions, and simply got things done. She had spent the past week coordinating with officials, reviewing protocols, and ensuring that every aspect of the funeral would honor their mother's memory with the dignity she deserved. But as she stood there in the quiet of dawn and allowed herself a moment of pure grief, away from the cameras, away from the watchful eyes of the world, she let the tears come. Elizabeth had been more than just the queen to Anne. She had been her anchor, her guide, and in many ways her best friend. The woman who had taught her that duty was not a burden, but a privilege, that service to others was the highest calling, and that strength came not from hiding your emotions, but from knowing when and where to show them. The palace was already bustling with activity by the time and made her way to the breakfast room. Staff members moved with practiced efficiency, their faces respectfully composed despite the emotional weight of the day. She found Charles there, standing by the tall windows overlooking the gardens, his hands clasped behind his back in that familiar pose she had known since childhood. "Good morning," she said softly, approaching him with the careful grace that had been drilled into them both from an early age. Charles turned and was struck by how much older he looked. The past week had aged him years, the weight of sudden kingship settling on his shoulders like an invisible cloak. His eyes, red-rimmed from sleepless nights and private tears, met hers with a vulnerability that took her by surprise. "I keep expecting her to walk through that door," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "To tell us we're making too much fuss. The simple service would do perfectly well." Anne smiled sadly, remembering their mother's practical nature, her preference for simplicity even in the grandest of circumstances. Elizabeth had always been bemused by the elaborate ceremonies that surrounded her, treating them as necessary theatrical performances rather than genuine expressions of her desires. She would have hated the thought of the entire world stopping for her, and agreed, moving to stand beside her brother. Remember how she used to say that the monarchy should never overshadow the people it served? They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two siblings who had shared a lifetime of unique experiences that no one else could truly understand. They had grown up in the fishbowl of public life, learned to navigate the complex waters of royal duty, while somehow maintaining their individual identities. They had weathered scandals and celebrations, births and deaths, always with their mother as the steady center of their universe. "Are you ready for today?" Anne asked, though she knew the question was somewhat pointless. No one could be ready for something like this. The final goodbye to the woman who had been the definition of their world for over 7 decades. Charles was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the palace gardens. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to encompass not just personal grief, but the enormous responsibility that had suddenly fallen to him. "I don't know how she did it," he said. 70 years of this, the weight of it all, the constant scrutiny, the decisions that affect millions of lives. And she made it look effortless. Even in her final days, she was still working, still caring about everyone except herself. And watched her brother carefully, recognizing the signs of the emotional storm building beneath his carefully controlled exterior. Charles had always felt things deeply, perhaps too deeply for someone destined for the throne. Their mother had possessed an almost supernatural ability to compartmentalize her emotions, to separate her private grief from her public duties. But Charles wore his heart closer to the surface and worried about how he would handle the day ahead. "She prepared you for this," and reminded him gently. "Every conversation, every decision she included you in, every moment she spent teaching you about duty and service, it was all preparation for today and all the days that will follow." Charles nodded, but she could see the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The transition from heir to monarch was something that could never be fully prepared for, no matter how many decades of training preceded it. It was like learning to swim by reading about water. Until you were actually drowning, you never really knew if you had the strength to stay afloat. The morning progressed with military precision, each family member taking their place in the carefully choreographed sequence of events that would unfold over the coming hours. And watched as Charles transformed before her eyes, his private vulnerability gradually being replaced by the public mask he had learned to wear so well. But she knew him too well to be fooled by the performance. Beneath the composed exterior, her brother was struggling with grief so profound that it threatened to overwhelm him. As they prepared to leave for Westminster Abbey, and made a silent promise to herself and to their mother's memory. She would be Charles's anchor today, just as Elizabeth had been theirs for so many years. She would watch over him, protect him if necessary, and ensure that he had the strength to carry on when the weight of the crown became too much to bear alone. The motorcade that would carry them to the Abbey was waiting in the palace courtyard, black vehicles gleaming in the pale morning light like a solemn procession of ravens, and took her place in the designated car, her mind running through the order of service one final time. She had memorized every detail, not because she didn't trust the officials who had planned it, but because controlling the small details helped her manage the overwhelming emotions that threatened to break free. As they drove through the streets of London, I was amazed by the crowds that had gathered despite the early hour. People of all ages lined the route, many holding flowers, others simply standing in respectful silence as the royal family made their way to say their final goodbye. She saw tears on the faces in the crowd, grief that mirrored her own, and was reminded once again of how deeply their mother had touched the lives of people she would never meet. "Look at them," she murmured to herself, pressing her hand against the window. "They loved her just as much as we did." The sight of Westminster Abbey took Anne's breath away, even though she had seen it countless times before. Today it seemed different somehow, more solemn, more sacred, as if the ancient stones themselves understood the significance of what was about to take place within their walls. The Gothic spires reached toward the gray sky like prayers made manifest in stone, and felt a deep sense of connection to all the generations of royals who had found their final rest within these walls. As they approached the entrance and caught sight of Charles in the car ahead of her, even from behind, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held his head a little too rigidly. She knew that look. It was the same expression he had worn as a child when he was trying desperately not to cry in front of their stern tutors. The moment had arrived. Soon, they would step out of their cars and into the glare of international attention, where every expression would be analyzed, every gesture interpreted, every tear or lack thereof would be scrutinized by billions of watching eyes. And straightened her shoulders and prepared to do what she had been trained to do since birth, to serve, to honor, and to carry the weight of the monarchy with dignity and grace. But as she watched Charles emerge from his car ahead of her, she also prepared to do something else, to be his sister first and a princess second. Today, more than any other day, her brother would need someone who loved him not for his title or his position, but simply for who he was, and was determined to be that person, no matter what the cost to her own composed facade. Westminster Abbey had seen many momentous occasions throughout its nearly 1,000-year history, but perhaps none quite like this. As Princess and stepped from her car and onto the ancient stones, she felt the weight of history pressing down upon her shoulders like a tangible force. The Abbey's Gothic arches seemed to stretch impossibly high above them, creating a cathedral of shadows and light that felt both intimate and eternal. The congregation was already assembled inside. 2,000 of the most powerful and influential people in the world all gathered to pay their final respects to a woman who had defined an era. Presidents and prime ministers, kings and queens, celebrities and commoners who had touched Elizabeth's life in meaningful ways, all sitting together in the democracy of grief that death brings to every human gathering, and paused for a moment before entering, allowing herself to absorb the magnitude of what was happening. Her mother, who had always preferred quiet family gatherings to grand state occasions, would have been both humbled and slightly overwhelmed by the scale of love and respect on display. But she also would have understood that this was bigger than personal preference. This was the world saying goodbye to an icon, a symbol of stability in an increasingly uncertain world. Charles stood beside the Abbey entrance, greeting heads of state with the mechanical precision of someone running on autopilot, and watched him carefully, noting the subtle signs of strain that only someone who had known him for 73 years would recognize. The way his left hand trembled slightly before he clasped it behind his back. The barely perceptible pause before he smiled at each dignitary. The manner in which his eyes seemed to look through people rather than at them, as if he was seeing something far beyond the present moment. President Biden approached, his own face etched with genuine sorrow, and observed the brief conversation between the two men. Charles's response was appropriate, gracious, everything it should have been, and could see the effort it cost him. Each interaction was another small weight added to the enormous burden he was already carrying. "Your Majesty," and heard herself saying as she approached her brother, using his new title deliberately. She had decided during the car ride that she would not contribute to his sense of unreality by pretending this day was anything other than what it was, his first major public appearance as king. Charles turned to her, and, for just a moment, his carefully constructed composure cracked. She saw the lost little boy who used to come to her room during thunderstorms, the uncertain teenager who had confided his fears about his future role, the middle-aged man who had sometimes wondered if he would ever get the chance to serve as his mother had served. "And," he said, and her name carried the weight of a lifetime of shared experiences, unspoken understanding, and unconditional love. "We'll get through this together," she told him quietly, placing her hand briefly on his arm in a gesture that might have seemed casual to observers, but carried deep meaning between siblings who had learned to communicate volumes with the smallest of touches. As they made their way into the Abbey, and was struck by the hush that fell over the congregation, it was not merely the quiet of respect, but something deeper, a collective holding of breath, as if the entire world was aware that they were witnesses to the end of an era. The Elizabethan age, which had lasted longer than most lifetimes, was officially concluding, and with it came uncertainty about what the future would hold. The royal family took their places in the front row, and found herself studying the faces of her relatives, each processing this moment in their own way. William sat with the bearing of a future king, his training evident in every control movement, but she could see the grief he was working to contain. Harry, who had flown in from California, looked older than his years, the weight of family tensions and personal struggles evident in the tight lines around his eyes. But it was Charles who drew most of her attention. As they waited for the service to begin, she watched him stare at their mother's coffin, draped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown, the orb, and the scepter. These symbols of monarchy that Elizabeth had worn with such dignity for 7 decades now rested on her coffin like beautiful, but heavy reminders of the burden that had now passed to him. And remember the conversation they had had just days after their mother's death, when Charles had confided his fears about being worthy of the throne. She made it look so easy, he had said then, but I know it wasn't. I know the sacrifices she made, the loneliness she endured, the impossible decisions she had to make every single day. How do I measure up to that legacy? The Archbishop of Canterbury began the service, his voice echoing through the ancient space with words that had comforted the grieving for centuries. And found herself watching Charles rather than listening to the familiar liturgy. She could see him fighting an internal battle, struggling to maintain his composure while simultaneously trying to process the reality that his mother was truly gone. The first hymn began, "The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended," and in her Charles's voice joined the congregation's strong and clear despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Elizabeth had chosen this hymn specifically and knew because it spoke to the continuity of service that transcended individual lives. The sun that bids us rest is waking our brethren 'neath the western sky. The words proclaimed, a reminder that while one reign was ending, the monarchy itself would continue. As the service progressed, and found herself remembering moments from their childhood that seemed especially poignant now. Elizabeth teaching them both to ride, insisting that they learn not just the technical skills, but the patience and empathy required to work with the horses. "Animals don't care about your title," their mother had said. "They respond only to your character." It was a lesson that had shaped both of them in profound ways. She remembered family holidays at Balmoral, where Elizabeth would shed her formal persona and become simply Mummy again, teaching them to fish in the Scottish streams and identify different bird species during long walks across the moors. Those moments of normalcy had been precious beyond measure, stolen hours when they could simply be a family rather than an institution. The readings continued, each one chosen by Elizabeth herself during her final weeks, when she had insisted on being involved in planning her own funeral despite her failing health, and had been amazed by her mother's attention to detail even then, her determination to ensure that the service reflected not just royal tradition, but her personal faith and values. Prime Minister Liz Truss rose to give the first reading, and was struck by how young she looked standing at the lectern where so many historic speeches had been delivered. Elizabeth had met with Truss just 2 days before her death, fulfilling her constitutional duties even as her strength was failing. It had been one of her final acts as queen, a perfect example of the dedication that had defined her entire reign. As Truss began to read from the book of Ecclesiastes, "For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven," and noticed Charles's breathing become more labored. His hands, which had been clasped calmly in his lap, were now gripping each other with white-knuckled intensity. She could see the muscles in his jaw working as he fought to maintain control. The words continued to wash over the congregation like waves of comfort and sorrow. A time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up what is planted. And thought about how these ancient words seemed written specifically for this moment, for this transition from one reign to another, from one generation's service to the next. But her attention kept returning to Charles, who seemed to be struggling more with each passing minute. She could see him trying to focus on the service, trying to be present for this final farewell to their mother. But the weight of his new responsibilities was clearly overwhelming him. Every protocol he had to follow, Every gesture that would be analyzed by historians for generations to come, every word he would speak, it all felt impossibly heavy in a moment when he simply wanted to grieve for his mother, and made a quiet decision. Throughout the remainder of the service, she would watch over her brother with the protective instincts that had been honed over decades of shared public appearances. She would be ready to steady him if he faltered, to provide silent support if he needed it, to be whatever he needed her to be in this moment of profound vulnerability. The second reading approached, and could feel the tension building in the abbey like pressure before a storm. She didn't know it yet, but they were approaching the moment that would break Charles's carefully maintained composure completely. The moment when the weight of being king would collide with the simple human need to mourn his mother, and when she would have to make a choice between royal protocol and sisterly love. The moment came without warning, like a crack appearing suddenly, in what had seemed like an unbreakable surface. Archbishop Justin Welby had begun his sermon, his voice carrying across the vast space of Westminster Abbey with words chosen specifically to honor Elizabeth's life of service, and was listening with half her attention while keeping the other half focused on Charles, who had been growing increasingly tense as the service progressed. She was joyful, present to so many, touching a multitude of lives. The Archbishop was saying, his words painting a picture of the woman they had all known and loved in different ways. But, as he continued, describing Elizabeth's unwavering faith and dedication to duty, and noticed Charles's breathing becoming more irregular. The breaking point came when the Archbishop began speaking about Elizabeth as a mother. The grief of this day felt throughout the nation, and the Commonwealth is the measure of the love she inspired through her care for others, her commitment to family. The words were meant to be comforting, but for Charles, they seemed to unlock something that he had been desperately trying to keep contained, and watched in growing concern as her brother's shoulders began to shake almost imperceptibly. His hands, which had been so carefully positioned on his knees, started to tremble. She could see him fighting it, trying to summon the iron self-control that had been drilled into them both from childhood. But grief, she knew, was not subject to royal protocol. The Archbishop's voice continued, warm and compassionate as he spoke about Elizabeth's legacy, and was no longer listening to the words. Her entire focus was on Charles, on the internal battle she could see playing out across his features. He was losing the fight against his emotions, and she realized with a mixture of sympathy and alarm that he was about to break down completely in front of 2 billion watching eyes. She was a constant for us all, the Archbishop said, and those words seemed to be the final blow to Charles's defenses. The reality of that statement, that their constant, their anchor, their guiding star was gone, hit him like a physical force, and saw his face crumble, saw 73 years of royal training abandoned in a moment of pure human grief. The tears came first, sliding down his cheeks despite his desperate attempts to stop them. Then his shoulders began to shake more violently, and realized that her brother, the King of England, the head of the Commonwealth, the man who was supposed to be the steady center of the monarchy, was about to break down completely. Without hesitation, and moved closer to Charles on the pew. Royal protocol dictated that she should maintain her position, that public displays of emotion should be controlled and dignified, that the cameras capturing every moment should see only composed grief. But it had never been one to put protocol above human need, and right now, her brother needed her more than the monarchy needed perfect optics. She reached out and took Charles's hand in hers, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that was both intimate and protective. The movement was subtle enough that many in the congregation might not have noticed, but the cameras caught it and didn't care. Her brother was drowning in grief, and she was going to throw him a lifeline whether it was appropriate or not. Charles's grip on her hand was desperate, like a drowning man clinging to a rope. She could feel his whole body trembling, could sense the tremendous effort he was making to keep from sobbing aloud. The weight of being king in this moment, of having to grieve publicly while maintaining dignity, of representing not just his own loss, but the nation's, was crushing him. "It's all right," and whispered, so quietly that only he could hear. "I'm here. We're going to get through this together." But Charles was past the point where words could help. The dam had burst, and 73 years of careful emotional control was washing away in a flood of grief that he could no longer contain. His breathing became ragged, his attempts to compose himself growing more desperate and less effective with each passing second, and made a decision that would be talked about for years to come. Moving with the authority that came from being the daughter of one monarch and the sister of another, she shifted even closer to Charles, essentially shielding him with her body. She positioned herself so that the cameras would have a harder time capturing his breakdown, creating a small pocket of privacy in the midst of the most public funeral in modern history. "Look at me," she said softly, turning slightly so that Charles could meet her eyes without the cameras catching his tear-streaked face. "Remember what Mummy used to say about difficult moments. This too shall pass, but we'll face it together." The reference to their mother's favorite phrase seemed to ground Charles slightly, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this impossible moment. Elizabeth had faced her own share of public grief. The death of her father when she was barely 25, the loss of her sister Margaret, the countless state funerals she had attended as a representative of the nation's mourning. But she had always had the strength to carry on, to be what others needed her to be. "I can't do this without her," Charles whispered, his voice so broken that Anne's heart ached for him. "I don't know how to be king without her guidance. What if I fail? What if I'm not worthy of what she built?" And understood then that this wasn't just grief over losing his mother. It was terror at the magnitude of what he had inherited. Charles had spent his entire adult life preparing to be king, but the reality of it, hitting him at the moment of his deepest personal loss, was overwhelming him completely. "You won't fail," Anne said with quiet conviction. "She spent 70 years preparing you for this moment. Every conversation you had with her, every decision she included you in, every moment she spent teaching you about service, it was all for this. You are ready, even if you don't feel ready." The Archbishop's sermon was drawing to a close, and knew they had only moments before the next part of the service would require Charles to participate more actively. She could see him trying to pull himself together, trying to summon the strength to continue, but he was shaking so badly that she worried he might not be able to stand when the time came. Making another split-second decision, and removed her own gloves and used her handkerchief to gently wipe the tears from Charles's face, the gesture so tender and protective that several people in the congregation were moved to tears themselves. She was essentially mothering the King of England in front of the watching world, but she didn't care about appearances. Her brother needed care, and she was going to provide it. "We're going to stand for him in just a moment," she told him quietly. "Lean on me if you need to. Use my strength until you find your own again." Charles nodded, his gratitude evident even through his tears. Anne's steady presence was like an anchor in the storm of his emotions, reminding him that he didn't have to face this alone. She had always been his protector in childhood, the sister who stood up to bullies and defended him when he was too sensitive for the harsh realities of royal life. Now she was doing it again, creating a shield of love and support around him when he was at his most vulnerable. The congregation rose for the hymn, "Love Divine, All Loves Excelling," and felt Charles struggle to get to his feet. She stood with him, keeping their hands linked, providing the physical support he needed to remain upright. His voice was barely audible as he attempted to sing, but Anne's clear, strong soprano carried them both through the familiar words that their mother had loved. As the hymn continued, and watched Charles slowly begin to regain some composure, the familiar rhythm of the music, the support of her presence, and, perhaps most importantly, the knowledge that he wasn't facing this alone seemed to give him the strength to continue. He straightened his shoulders gradually, his breathing became more regular, and though tears continued to flow, they were quieter now, more controlled. But I knew this was far from over. The most difficult part of the service was still ahead, the final blessing, the removal of the crown, and regalia from their mother's coffin, and the moment when Elizabeth would leave Westminster Abbey for the last time. Charles would need every ounce of strength to get through what was coming, and was determined to be his source of that strength, no matter what it cost her own composure. The hymn ended, and Westminster Abbey fell into a silence so profound that and could hear her own heartbeat. This was the moment she had been dreading. The final blessing and the ceremonial removal of the crown, orb, and scepter from their mother's coffin. These symbols of monarchy that Elizabeth had worn for 70 years would be lifted away, marking the definitive end of her reign and the beginning of Charles's. It was a moment of such symbolic weight that and could feel it pressing down on the entire congregation. Archbishop Welby stepped forward to give the final blessing, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. Go forth into the world in peace. Be of good courage. Hold fast that which is good. Render to no one evil for evil. Strengthen the faint-hearted. Support the weak. Help the afflicted. Honor everyone. Love and serve the Lord, rejoicing in the power of the Holy Spirit. And felt Charles's hand tighten in hers as the words washed over them. She could sense him trying to draw strength from the familiar liturgy, but she could also feel the tremor that ran through his entire body as they approached the moment when the crown would be removed from their mother's coffin. That crown, the imperial state crown that Elizabeth had worn to countless state openings of Parliament, that had sat upon her head during the most important moments of her reign, would soon be lifted away forever. The Dean of Westminster approached the coffin with measured steps, each footfall echoing through the vast space like a countdown to finality, and watched Charles's face as the Dean reached for the crown, and she saw something break in her brother's expression that went beyond grief. It was the look of a man watching his entire world change in real time, watching the last connection to his mother's living presence being severed. As the crown was lifted from the coffin, Charles made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. The sight of that golden symbol being separated from Elizabeth, the woman who had worn it with such dignity for so many decades, seemed to physically wound him, and felt his knees buckle slightly, and she immediately pressed closer, using her body to support his weight while maintaining the illusion of composure for the watching world. She's not in that crown, and whispered urgently in his ear, try to anchor him to something beyond the devastating symbolism of the moment. She's not in any of those symbols. She's in the lessons she taught us, in the love she showed us, in the example she set for how to serve others with grace and dignity. But Charles was watching the orb and scepter being removed with the same devastating focus, seeing not just ceremonial objects, but the physical manifestations of a burden that was now his to carry, and could feel him struggling to breathe, could sense the panic that was threatening to overwhelm him completely. The weight of 70 years of tradition, of expectations from millions of people, of a role that had literally defined his entire existence. It was all crystallizing in this moment of ritualistic transfer. The congregation began to sing God Save the King for the first time, and the sound hit Charles like a physical blow, and felt him sway against her as 2,000 voices proclaimed his new title, making the transition undeniably real. She could see tears streaming down his face again, but these were different from the tears of grief he had shed earlier. These were tears of overwhelm, of a man being crushed by the magnitude of what he had inherited, and made a decision that would define not just this moment, but the early months of Charles's reign. Instead of allowing him to suffer alone, instead of pretending that royal stoicism was more important than human compassion, she began to sing the national anthem herself. Not for the cameras, not for protocol, but for her brother. Her voice, clear and strong, cut through his panic like a lifeline. God save our gracious King. Long live our noble King, she sang, her eyes locked on Charles's face, willing him to hear not just the words, but the love and support behind them. God save the King. Slowly, gradually, Charles began to join in. His voice was broken and barely audible at first, but With Anne's steady presence beside him, he found the strength to sing the words that proclaimed his own kingship. It was a moment of heartbreaking beauty, a new king finding his voice literally and metaphorically, supported by a sister who had chosen love over protocol. The service moved toward its conclusion with a solemn procession that would carry Elizabeth's coffin from the abbey. And knew this would be another crucial test for Charles. The moment when he would have to watch his mother leave Westminster Abbey for the final time, beginning her journey to Windsor Castle, where she would be buried beside his father, Prince Philip. As the bearer party approached the coffin and felt Charles tense beside her again, she realized that for him, this wasn't just the end of the funeral service. It was the moment when Elizabeth would truly be gone, when the woman who had been the center of his universe for 73 years would pass beyond his reach forever. Remember, and whispered as they prepared to follow the coffin out of the abbey, she's not leaving us. She's going home. She's going to be with Papa again, and that's what she wanted. The reminder of their father seemed to ground Charles slightly. Philip's death the previous year had been devastating for Elizabeth, and in her final months, she had spoken often about missing him, about looking forward to being reunited with the man who had been her partner and support for over 70 years. Thinking of their parents together again gave the moment a sense of completion rather than just loss. The procession began, and watched Charles struggle with each step as they followed their mother's coffin down the aisle of Westminster Abbey. 2 billion people were watching this moment, analyzing every expression, every gesture, every sign of emotion or lack thereof. But Anne's focus was entirely on her brother, on the man who had to learn to be king while simultaneously saying goodbye to his mother. As they emerged from the Abbey into the gray London afternoon, and was struck by the sea of faces that greeted them. Thousands of people lined the streets, many in tears, all united in this moment of collective mourning. She could see flags at half-mast stretching into the distance, could hear the muffled drums of the military procession that would escort Elizabeth on her final journey. Charles paused for a moment at the top of the Abbey steps, looking out at the crowds, at the evidence of how deeply his mother had been loved, and stood beside him, still holding his hand, still providing the anchor he needed in this storm of emotion and responsibility. She could see him trying to process not just his own grief, but the grief of an entire nation that was looking to him now for leadership and stability. They loved her so much, Charles said quietly, his voice full of wonder at the outpouring of public affection. And they'll love you too, and replied with quiet conviction. Not because you're perfect, but because you're real, because you care as deeply as she did, because you understand that being king means serving others, not being served. The gun carriage that would carry Elizabeth to Wellington Arch was waiting, surrounded by the precision and pageantry that marked all royal ceremonies. And could see that Charles was struggling with the symbolism of it all. The military honors, the state procession, the elaborate ritual that surrounded even death in the royal family. Elizabeth had always been slightly embarrassed by such displays, preferring simplicity to grandeur. As they took their places in the procession behind the gun carriage, and realized that this was the moment when Charles truly became king in the eyes of the watching world. Not when he was proclaimed, not when he took his oath, but here, walking behind his mother's coffin, accepting the burden of the crown even while drowning in grief, showing the nation that he would carry on the work she had started even at the cost of his own personal comfort. The journey to Wellington Arch would take them through the heart of London, past crowds of mourners who had come to say their own farewells to the Queen, and knew that every step would be difficult for Charles, every moment a test of his ability to balance private grief with public duty. But she also knew that she would be there beside him, just as she had always been, ready to catch him if he fell, and to remind him of his strength when he forgot he had any. As the procession began to move through the streets of London, and made a silent promise to her mother's memory and to the brother walking beside her. She would be his protector, his supporter, his reminder of who he was beneath the weight of the crown. Today had shown her that being royal didn't mean being superhuman. It meant being human in the most visible and vulnerable way possible. And If Charles could learn to be king while remaining compassionate and real, if he could rule with the same blend of duty and humanity that their mother had shown, then perhaps the monarchy could evolve into something even more meaningful than what had come before. The procession through London was unlike anything Anne had ever experienced. As they walked behind their mother's coffin through streets lined with mourners, she felt the weight of history settling around them like a cloak. Every step took them deeper into Charles's new reality as king, but also deeper into a shared national grief that seemed to unite people across all boundaries of class, age, and background. The crowds were massive, but respectfully quiet, creating a corridor of silence broken only by the measured beat of drums and the clip-clop of horses' hooves on the ancient stones, and kept her attention divided between the overwhelming scene around them and Charles walking beside her. He had managed to regain some composure since his breakdown in the Abbey, but she could see the effort it was costing him with each step. As they passed Buckingham Palace, the place that had been home to all of them for so many decades, and noticed Charles's pace falter slightly. The palace looked different somehow, draped in black and surrounded by mountains of flowers that mourners had left in tribute to Elizabeth. It was no longer their mother's palace, but a transition that seemed to hit him with fresh force as they walked past the familiar iron gates. "That's your home now," Anne said quietly, the words carrying both comfort and challenge. "Mummy spent 70 years making it a place of service and dedication. Now it's your turn to decide what it will become." Charles nodded, but Anne could see the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The palace represented so much more than just a residence. It was the center of the monarchy, the place from which he would have to lead not just Britain, but the entire Commonwealth. The thought of making decisions from the same rooms where Elizabeth had guided the nation through wars, celebrations, scandals, and transformations seemed to overwhelm him all over again. The journey to Wellington Arch took nearly an hour, and, with each passing minute, Anne watched her brother grow stronger. It was as if the act of walking through London, of seeing the genuine love and respect that people had for their family and institution, was reminding him of why the monarchy mattered. These weren't just empty ceremonies or outdated traditions. They were rituals that connected people to something larger than themselves, that provided continuity and stability in a rapidly changing world. At Wellington Arch, they would have to say their final public goodbye to Elizabeth before her coffin was loaded onto the hearse that would carry her to Windsor Castle for the private burial service, and dreaded this moment almost as much as she had dreaded the removal of the crown, knowing that it would represent another breaking point for Charles. The ceremony at the Arch was brief, but intensely moving. As the coffin was transferred from the gun carriage to the hearse, and watched Charles struggle once again with the finality of it all. This was the moment when Elizabeth would leave London forever, when she would make her final journey to the place where she would rest beside Philip for eternity. But something had changed in Charles during the walk through London, and could see it in the way he held his shoulders, in the steadier rhythm of his breathing, in the way he looked at the coffin now, with love rather than just devastation. The public outpouring of affection for their mother, the sight of people from all walks of life united in grief and respect, had reminded him of what Elizabeth had always told them, that being royal was not about privilege, but about service. "She did this walk so many times," Charles said softly as they watched the hearse being prepared. "For other people's funerals, other families' grief. She carried their sorrow, just as the nation is carrying ours today," and felt a surge of pride in her brother's words. He was beginning to understand that the overwhelming public response to their mother's death wasn't just about losing a beloved figurehead. It was about recognizing a life dedicated entirely to others. Elizabeth had never taken a true vacation, never retired, never put her own needs before those of the people she served. And now Charles was beginning to see that this legacy of service was what he had inherited along with the crown. The drive to Windsor Castle was conducted in relative privacy, giving the royal family a brief respite from the intense public scrutiny they had endured all day, and sat beside Charles in the car, watching him process everything that had happened. The breakdown in Westminster Abbey, the overwhelming response from the public, the reality of his new role. It was all swirling together in a mixture of grief, fear, and growing determination. "I keep thinking about what she would want me to do," Charles admitted as they drove through the countryside toward Windsor. "How she would want me to handle this responsibility, what kind of king she would want me to be, and had been thinking about the same thing throughout the long day." Elizabeth had never been one for lengthy speeches about duty or responsibility. She had taught by example, showing them through her actions what it meant to serve others with grace and humility. But she had also been clear about one thing. The monarchy had to evolve to survive, had to find ways to remain relevant and meaningful to each new generation. She would want you to be yourself, and said after a long moment of consideration. Not a copy of her, not a caricature of what you think a king should be, but yourself with all your passions, your concerns, your genuine care for people and causes. That's what made her special, the fact that she never pretended to be someone she wasn't. The private burial service at St. George's Chapel was mercifully smaller and more intimate than the morning's state funeral. Only close family and a few personal friends attended, creating an atmosphere where grief could be more personal, less performed for cameras and commentators. And watched as Charles took his place near their mother's coffin for the final time, and she was amazed by the transformation she saw in him. The man who had broken down completely just hours earlier was now standing with quiet dignity, his grief still evident, but no longer overwhelming his ability to function. He participated in the readings, sang the hymns with a steady voice, and even smiled slightly when the Archbishop spoke about Elizabeth's love for her corgis and her mischievous sense of humor. It was during the final hymn, Love Divine, All Loves Excelling, the same one they had sung at Westminster Abbey, that and realized what had changed. Charles had stopped fighting his emotions and started accepting them as part of his strength rather than a weakness. He had learned, in the space of a single day, that being king didn't mean being perfect or invulnerable. It meant being real, being compassionate, being willing to show the same humanity that their mother had always possessed beneath her composed public persona. As Elizabeth's coffin was lowered into the vault beside Philip's, Charles stepped forward to cast earth onto it in the ancient ritual of committal. His hand trembled only slightly as he performed this final act, and felt a profound sense of completion. Their mother was at peace, reunited with the man she had loved for more than 70 years. And Charles was beginning his reign not with the cold perfection of traditional monarchy, but with the warm imperfection of genuine humanity. The reception following the burial was subdued, but meaningful, giving family members a chance to share memories and support each other without the pressure of public observation. And found herself in quiet conversation with Charles, reflecting on everything that had happened during this impossible day. "I'm not sure I'll ever feel ready for this," Charles admitted, looking out at the gardens where he and had played as children during visits to see their grandparents. "But I think I understand now that feeling ready isn't the point. The point is being willing to try, to serve, to learn from mistakes, and keep going anyway," and smiled at her brother's words, recognizing in them the wisdom that their mother had spent decades trying to instill in both of them. Elizabeth had never claimed to be perfect, had never pretended that being queen was easy or natural. What had made her extraordinary was her willingness to keep trying, to keep learning, to keep putting the needs of others before her own comfort or convenience. "She will be proud of you today," and told Charles with quiet conviction. "Not because you handled everything perfectly, but because you were real, because you showed the world that kings can grieve, that leaders can be vulnerable, that strength comes not from hiding your emotions, but from acknowledging them and moving forward anyway." As the evening wore on and family members began to leave Windsor Castle and realized that something fundamental had changed in her relationship with Charles. Throughout their childhood and adult lives, she had often been the protector, the practical one who looked after her more sensitive brother. But today had shown her that Charles possessed a strength she had never fully recognized, the strength to be authentically himself even under the most impossible circumstances. The breakdown in Westminster Abbey hadn't been a sign of weakness. It had been a moment of profound honesty that had connected him to millions of people watching around the world. In showing his grief so openly and allowing himself to be comforted by his sister, Charles had demonstrated a kind of leadership that their mother had always valued, but had rarely been able to show publicly. He had proven that being royal didn't mean being superhuman. It meant being the best possible version of human. As Anne prepared to leave Windsor and return to her own home, she reflected on the lessons of this extraordinary day. She had learned that love and duty were not opposing forces, but complementary ones, that supporting her brother meant sometimes choosing compassion over protocol, and that the monarchy's future lay not in maintaining rigid traditions, but in finding ways to remain genuinely connected to the people it served. Charles walked her to her car, and as they said goodbye, and felt a sense of peace that had been absent since their mother's death. Elizabeth was gone, but her legacy lived on, not just in the institution of the monarchy, but in the values she had instilled in her children. Charles would be a different kind of king than their mother had been queen, but that was exactly what the world needed. He would rule with his heart on his sleeve, with compassion as his guide, and with the understanding that true strength came from acknowledging vulnerability rather than hiding it. "We'll get through this together," Anne told Charles one final time, echoing the words she had spoken to comfort him in Westminster Abbey. "Just as we always have, just as she taught us to." As her car pulled away from Windsor Castle and looked back at the ancient stones that had witnessed so much history, so much joy and sorrow, so many transitions from one reign to another. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to serve. But tonight, she was content in the knowledge that Charles was ready to meet them. Not as the perfect king he thought he needed to be, but as the compassionate, authentic leader the world actually needed. The day that had begun with such profound grief was ending with something Anne hadn't expected: hope. Hope that the monarchy could evolve while maintaining its essential purpose. Hope that Charles would find his own path to greatness. And hope that the love Elizabeth had shown them all would continue to guide their decisions and define their service to others. In breaking down and being rebuilt in a single day, Charles had shown the world what the future of monarchy could look like: real, compassionate, and unafraid to be human in the most public of circumstances.